Mail-order bride rejected at the depot, until a cowboy lifted her trunk and took her home. The sun had barely risen over the distant hills when she arrived. Her steps were slow, almost hesitant, as if each one weighed more than the last. Dust clung to her worn boots, and the wind tangled her long hair around her face. She carried a small bag that looked far too light for someone who had traveled so far. Yet it seemed as though she had carried more than her share of burdens in her heart. The vast openness of the plains stretched before her, quiet except for the soft rustle of the tall grass and the occasional call of a distant bird. She paused at the edge of the ranch, her eyes scanning the modest wooden buildings and the corrals that held a few cattle, moving lazily under the weak morning sun. A fence line ran along the horizon, dividing the land into neat sections, and beyond that, the hills rolled gently, their curves soft and endless. She took a deep breath, the kind that is meant to steady a weary soul, but sometimes only reminds a person how tired they truly are. She was tired of moving, tired of hiding, and most of all, tired of feeling like she had nowhere to belong. The cowboy saw her before she could speak. He had been repairing a fence near the edge of the property when he noticed the small figure approaching. At first, he assumed she was another traveler passing through. People sometimes walked the long trails that cut across the plains, but something about the way she carried herself made him pause. There was no swagger, no confidence, only a quiet, almost fragile presence. He wiped the sweat from his brow and stepped closer. "Morning," he said cautiously, unsure if she would respond. She looked at him, her eyes tired but alert, and gave a small nod. "Morning," she replied softly. Her voice was quiet, but there was a certain strength beneath it, a hint that she had faced many things alone and survived. He studied her for a moment. She was not dressed for travel in the cold or rain. Her clothes were worn and patched, and though she carried herself with dignity, it was clear she had endured hardships that had left marks on more than just her clothing. There was a heaviness in her gaze, as though she carried the weight of memories too painful to share. "Are you looking for a place to stay?" he asked, keeping his tone neutral. He had learned over the years that some travelers preferred to be left alone, and pushing too hard often did more harm than good. She hesitated, then shook her head slightly. "Just for the night," she said, her voice almost a whisper. "I won't trouble you." He could see the pride in her posture, even in her exhaustion. There was no begging, no pleading, only a quiet insistence that she did not want to be a burden. It struck him how many people carried that same fear, hiding it behind words or silence. He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he studied her, trying to read the story behind her eyes, the unspoken tales that had brought her to this remote ranch. "All right," he said finally. "You can stay the night. There's a guest room inside the main house. Just don't wander off." She nodded again, relief flickering briefly across her face before it was replaced by the usual mask of composure. "Thank you," she said simply. The cowboy turned and led her toward the house. The wooden boards creaked under their boots, the familiar sound grounding him in the rhythm of his daily life. The house itself was simple, practical, and worn by years of wind and sun. Inside, the air was warm and smelled faintly of wood smoke and old furniture. He motioned toward a small room with a bed neatly made. "You can put your bag down here." "There's water on the table if you need it," he said. She set her bag down carefully, almost ceremoniously, and sat on the edge of the bed for a moment. Her hands were folded in her lap, and she stared at them as if seeing something long forgotten. She seemed younger than she appeared, though life had added lines to her face and a cautiousness to her eyes that made her seem older. "I'll leave by morning," she said quietly, almost as if stating it would make it true. "I don't want to stay. I'm only a burden." The cowboy stopped in his tracks. He had heard words like that before, often from people who had faced hardships and believed that their pain was theirs alone to bear. But hearing them from someone so visibly worn yet so composed struck a chord. He wanted to say something, to assure her that she wasn't a burden, but he knew words were not enough. Actions mattered more than promises, and he had learned that lessons like these could not be rushed. Instead, he nodded slowly. "You're not a burden," he said softly. "But if you need a place to rest, you're welcome here for the night."
Shh. She didn't respond, only looked up at him with eyes that flickered between suspicion and gratitude.
He could tell she had learned not to trust easily. Her life had taught her to rely on herself, to expect disappointment, and to accept hardship as a constant companion. Yet something about the quiet of this place, the slow rhythm of the ranch, seemed to offer a brief respite from the storm that always followed her. The morning passed slowly. She helped with small chores, moving quietly through the house and yard. She swept floors, gathered firewood, and even offered to help feed the animals, though the cowboy gently insisted she rest. Each task was done with careful attention, as if by doing small things well, she could prove her worth, or perhaps remind herself that she was capable. The cowboy watched her work, noticing how careful she was, how her movements were precise and deliberate. There was grace in her exhaustion, a kind of quiet resilience that spoke louder than any words could. He wondered what had brought her here, what roads she had traveled, and what losses she carried silently with her. By late afternoon, she sat on the porch, staring at the horizon as the sky turned soft shades of pink and gold. The wind picked up slightly, tugging at her hair, and she wrapped her shawl tighter around her shoulders. The cowboy joined her after a while, settling into a chair beside hers without speaking. There was no need for words. The silence itself was comforting, a rare gift for both of them. "Why are you traveling alone?" he asked finally, breaking the quiet. She looked at him, her gaze steady but weary. "I have no one," she said simply. "I don't want to cause trouble for anyone, so I keep moving." He nodded slowly, understanding more than she could know. Life had a way of teaching people to survive on their own, to hide pain and to protect themselves from disappointment. But sometimes, survival meant allowing someone else to share the burden, even if only for a moment. As the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the land, he could see the tension in her shoulders, the exhaustion in her movements. Yet there was also a quiet strength, a determination that refused to be broken completely. She was fragile in some ways, but unyielding in others, a combination that made her both cautious and remarkable. Night fell, bringing with it the sounds of crickets and the distant lowing of cattle. She sat quietly, staring at the stars, lost in thoughts he could not reach. The cowboy watched from a distance, respecting her space but feeling the weight of her unspoken words. He knew that she would leave in the morning if left to her own devices. She had said so herself, and he had no intention of forcing her to stay. Yet he also knew that some people arrived at crossroads, moments where choices could change the path ahead. Perhaps tonight, in the quiet of the ranch, she could find a brief moment of peace. Perhaps just for a little while she could rest without feeling like a burden. And so the night stretched on, gentle and unhurried, carrying with it the quiet promise of understanding, compassion, and the possibility of connection. Morning arrived slowly on the ranch, soft lights spilling across the fields and casting long golden shadows. The wind whispered through the tall grass, carrying the faint scent of wild flowers and damp earth. The native woman stirred quietly, sitting up on the edge of the bed, her small bag still at her feet. Her movements were careful, measured, almost ritualistic, as if she were trying not to leave any trace of her presence. She had spent countless mornings like this, in places where she was only tolerated, never truly welcome. She dressed in the simple clothes she had traveled in, worn and patched, but neat. Her hands trembled slightly as she folded the blanket and straightened the room. Even in exhaustion, she seemed determined to leave the smallest mark of respect, to remind herself that she could still control the little things in life. She glanced toward the window, her eyes lingering on the distant hills. Each one of them felt like a barrier she had to cross. Each step forward a test she wasn't sure she could pass. Downstairs, the cowboy had already begun his morning routine. The smell of coffee brewing filled the house, mingling with the faint aroma of wood smoke from the fireplace. He moved quietly, careful not to disturb her. He had noticed how she carried herself, strong but cautious, and he wanted her to feel some comfort here, even if she refused to admit she needed it. After a moment, she descended the stairs, careful to step lightly. Her eyes met his for a brief moment, and he nodded, offering her a simple greeting. She returned it with a faint smile, the kind that held more emotion than words ever could. There was a quiet understanding between them. Words were not always necessary when two people had learned to survive through observation and instinct. The cowboy handed her a cup of warm coffee, though he could tell she had little appetite. She accepted it with a nod, her fingers wrapped around the cup as if it were an anchor to reality. They stood together in silence for a few moments, listening to the soft morning sounds, the distant lowing of cattle, the wind through the trees, and the gentle hum of life beginning on the ranch. "I'll leave by morning," she said quietly, her voice almost lost in the space between them. He sighed, not out of frustration, but from a deep understanding. He had heard those words before, from people who carried too much pain and refused to let anyone share it. "You don't have to leave," he said gently. "Not yet. Stay as long as you need." "I'm only a burden," she whispered, as if speaking the words aloud might make them less true. She had learned to believe it, had repeated it so many times to herself that it felt like the only truth in the world. The cowboy didn't argue. He knew words alone could not erase a lifetime of self-doubt and pain. Action spoke louder, and he planned to show her, in small ways, that she was valued, that her presence mattered, even if she had forgotten how to believe it. Breakfast was simple: eggs, bread, and a small portion of fresh fruit. She ate slowly, picking at her food as though each bite were carefully measured. The cowboy noticed, but said nothing. He had learned long ago that patience often spoke louder than any insistence. They ate in companionable silence, the kind that only comes from people who respect each other's space, but understand the weight of shared existence. After breakfast, she stepped outside, the cool morning air brushing against her face. She wandered to the fence line, looking out over the rolling hills. Her eyes were distant, watching not just the land but memories that she carried, memories that had shaped her into the cautious, quiet woman she had become. She remembered the long journeys, the places she had had to leave behind, and the people she had lost. Each memory was a small wound, stitched over by time, but never fully healed. The cowboy followed her at a distance, giving her space, but remaining close enough to intervene if needed. He had always been attuned to those who carried invisible burdens, and he recognized the signs of someone who had been shaped by struggle and loss. She moved slowly, deliberately, almost as if she were testing the air around her, the land itself, before committing to the moment. "Do you want to help with the animals?" he asked gently, breaking the quiet. She hesitated, then nodded. "If it's not too much," she said. Her voice was soft, but there was a quiet determination behind it. She had grown accustomed to hard work, to earning her place in every new setting, and she approached even the smallest task with care and attention. They moved together toward the corral. She watched him work, learning quickly the rhythms of the ranch, the small, precise motions needed to handle the cattle without startling them. She carried water buckets, swept the barn, and even helped mend a loose fence post. Each task was a quiet assertion of her presence, a way to prove, perhaps to herself more than anyone else, that she belonged, at least for the moment. The cowboy observed her carefully. She worked efficiently, her movements careful but confident. He noticed the small ways she adapted, the way she anticipated what was needed before being asked. Despite her quiet demeanor, there was strength in her hands and focus in her eyes. He felt a growing respect for her resilience, for the determination it took to keep moving forward despite the weight of the world on her shoulders. As the sun climbed higher, the native woman paused to rest. She sat on a wooden fence post, looking out over the open fields. The wind lifted her hair, and for a moment, she allowed herself to breathe without fear. She remembered a time when the wind had meant freedom, when it carried laughter and voices instead of sorrow. She closed her eyes, holding on to that fleeting memory, as if it could protect her from the burdens she carried. The cowboy approached and offered her a fresh glass of water. "You're doing well," he said, not as praise, but as recognition. She accepted it, her lips curving slightly in acknowledgement. "Thank you," she replied, her voice steady. "I'm not used to people noticing." He nodded, understanding more than she could know. Many who traveled alone learned to become invisible, to move through the world without leaving traces of themselves. She had survived by staying small, by believing she was only a burden. But here, in the quiet of the ranch, someone was willing to see her, and that recognition, small as it was, made a difference. The afternoon passed slowly, each hour marked by quiet work, soft conversations, and moments of silence that spoke louder than words. The native woman began to share small stories, fragments of her past, though she never revealed too much. She spoke of distant lands, of places she had once called home, of people she had known and lost. Her voice was calm, almost detached, but there was a quiet sadness beneath the surface, a longing for connection she had long denied herself. The cowboy listened, offering gentle encouragement, but never pressing for details. He had learned that healing began with trust, not interrogation, and in the way she shared pieces of her past, he saw the first signs of that trust beginning to grow. By late afternoon, they returned to the house. The sun was beginning to dip behind the hills, painting the sky with shades of pink and gold. She stood at the doorway, watching the horizon, the familiar mixture of awe and loneliness in her eyes. The cowboy joined her, standing silently, offering company without intrusion. "You don't have to leave," he said softly, echoing his earlier words. "Not yet. You can stay as long as you need." She turned to him, her expression guarded. "I'm only a burden," she whispered again, almost as if saying it aloud would make it true. He shook his head, his voice firm but gentle.
"No, you're not a burden."
"You're just tired, and it's okay to rest." For a moment she seemed to consider it, her gaze softening. She had spent so long believing she had to survive alone, that her presence was a weight on others. But here, in the quiet of the ranch, she saw a different possibility. Perhaps it was safe to let someone in, even for a short while. Perhaps it was safe to rest. The night fell slowly, the stars emerging one by one in the vast open sky. She sat on the porch, wrapped in a blanket, staring at the horizon. The cowboy remained nearby, giving her space but staying close enough to offer comfort. The wind whispered through the grass, carrying a sense of peace she had not felt in a long time. And in that quiet, suspended moment, the first flicker of hope appeared. It was faint, fragile, but it was there. A small spark that perhaps, for the first time in a long while, she could allow herself to stay, if only for a little while. The morning sun was warm, yet soft, as it poured over the rolling hills. The native woman stirred slowly, not out of obligation, but because she had learned long ago that each day was a gift, whether welcome or unwelcome. She dressed quietly, careful not to wake the cowboy, though he had long since stopped sleeping through her presence. She felt the weight of yesterday, the chores, the small talks, the quiet moments of observation still pressing lightly on her shoulders. It was strange to carry something without feeling it as a burden, even for a short time. She descended the stairs, moving with the same careful rhythm that had become her habit. The cowboy was in the kitchen, preparing breakfast with deliberate, slow movements, as if each action were part of a ritual. He glanced up as she entered, offering a small, encouraging nod. There was no need for words yet. The silence between them had become comfortable, almost protective. "Good morning," she said softly, the words barely louder than a whisper. "Morning," he replied, his voice steady and calm. "Sleep well?" She shook her head slightly, but a faint smile touched her lips. "As well as I could," she admitted. Her honesty was deliberate but cautious. She had learned not to give too much away too quickly. Breakfast was simple: bread, eggs, and fresh fruit, but she ate slowly, savoring the routine rather than the food itself. The cowboy noticed and offered no encouragement or complaint. She had learned to measure everything carefully, from the pace of her steps to the rhythm of her breathing. Every action was deliberate, every movement controlled. Even eating was a small act of discipline. After breakfast, they moved outside. The sun warmed the land, and the wind carried the faint smell of grass and earth. She walked slowly along the fence line, inspecting the cattle and listening to the distant sounds of the ranch. She had learned to notice details others often missed: the uneven ground, the color of the sky, the way the animals responded to changes in wind and light. Each observation was a small reassurance that she could still understand the world around her, even when her heart felt fragile. The cowboy followed her, keeping a careful distance. He had watched her carefully since she arrived, observing not only her actions but the way she carried herself. He could see the invisible weight she bore, the fear of being unwanted, the exhaustion from traveling alone, the quiet sadness that lingered in her eyes. He had seen such burdens before, but rarely had they been carried with such quiet dignity. "Do you want to help with the chores today?" he asked, his voice gentle, not insistent. She hesitated, then nodded. "Yes," she said softly. "If it's okay?" He smiled faintly.
"It's more than okay," he replied.
"It helps to keep busy, and it's not much work." Together they moved around the ranch. She carried water, swept the barn, and repaired fences. Her movements were careful, precise, and surprisingly strong. Even in her quietness, she had a presence that could not be ignored. The cowboy noticed small things: how her hands worked efficiently, how her eyes scanned the land for changes, how her mind seemed always to be calculating the next step. There was a rhythm to her work, a steady confidence beneath her apparent fragility. During a break, they sat on the porch steps, looking out over the land. The sun was high and the air was warm but comfortable. She took a deep breath, letting it fill her lungs and calm her restless thoughts. For a long time she sat in silence, staring at the horizon as if searching for something she could not name. The cowboy watched her quietly for a moment. He could see the tension in her shoulders, the way her hands flexed and relaxed, as if she were holding invisible burdens. "You know," he said slowly, "you don't have to carry everything alone." She looked at him, her eyes wide, but wary. I've always carried things alone," she said softly. "It's what I know." "I understand," he said. "But sometimes sharing even a little makes a difference, even if it's just for a moment." She considered his words, her gaze dropping to her hands. It was strange, she realized, to be spoken to in this way. Most people either ignored her or treated her with pity. He neither ignored nor pitied her. He saw her. That small recognition was more powerful than any words could express. The afternoon moved on with quiet tasks, each one an opportunity for small connection. She helped feed the animals, worked in the garden, and even swept the porch. The cowboy observed quietly, offering assistance only when necessary. There was a subtle understanding between them. Work was not punishment, but a form of participation, a way to exist alongside each other without demanding anything more than presence. At one point, she stopped near the barn, glancing at a small, crooked fence that needed repair. She hesitated, unsure if she should attempt it herself. The cowboy noticed her pause and approached. "Do you want me to help?" he asked gently. She shook her head. "I can try," she said softly, almost as if speaking the words aloud gave her courage. He stood nearby, offering quiet support, watching as she worked carefully, her hands steady despite the uncertainty. There was determination in her movements, a stubbornness that refused to be broken, and when the task was finished, she stepped back, taking in the result with a small nod of satisfaction. "You did well," he said quietly. She glanced at him, her lips curving into the faintest smile. "Thank you," she said, her voice soft but sincere. Later, as the sun began to lower in the sky, they sat together on the porch again. The wind had softened, carrying the faint scents of the evening. She wrapped herself in a blanket, her gaze distant, and he sat quietly beside her. "You know," he said gently, "sometimes we need to let someone in, even a little, even if it feels strange." She shook her head slightly. "I'm not good at that," she admitted. "I've been alone for so long. I forget what it feels like to trust." "I understand," he said. "Trust doesn't come easy, but it can. Start small."
You can start by letting someone share the moment with you. That's all.
She was quiet for a long time, thinking about his words. She had spent years believing she was a burden, that her presence was unwanted, that her struggles were hers alone. But in this quiet place, with someone who did not demand her story but offered it space, she began to reconsider. Perhaps there was a way to exist alongside someone without feeling like she was taking up too much. Perhaps she could rest. The turning point came quietly, almost imperceptibly. As she sat, lost in thought, a sudden wave of fatigue swept over her. She leaned back, her eyes closing briefly, and the cowboy immediately reached out, steadying her.
"You need to rest," he said gently. I'll be fine," she whispered, trying to pull away.
"No," he said firmly but kindly. "It's okay to rest. You've been carrying too much for too long. Let someone else carry a little for a while." Her eyes opened, meeting his, and for the first time in many years, she allowed herself to accept that help might not be dangerous, that her presence might not be a burden, that someone could see her, understand her, and offer support without judgment. The evening passed slowly. They prepared a simple dinner together, sharing small conversation about the day's work and the animals. She laughed softly at one of his jokes, a quiet sound that seemed almost foreign to her. But it was genuine, and he recognized it as a milestone. As night fell, she sat again on the porch, staring at the stars. The air was cool, and the wind whispered through the grass. The cowboy remained nearby, respecting her space but offering silent companionship. She thought of the roads she had traveled, the people she had lost, and the life she had built through endurance and solitude. And for the first time, she allowed herself to imagine a different possibility, a life where she could rest, even briefly, without feeling guilty or weak. "Stay," he said softly, breaking the silence. "You don't have to go yet. Not if you don't want to." She looked at him, her eyes reflecting the flickering light of the porch. The words she had repeated to herself for so long, "I'm only a burden," seemed to falter under the weight of something new, hope. She considered leaving, as she had promised herself, but for the first time the thought of staying did not feel wrong. And in that quiet moment, with the stars overhead and the soft wind carrying the scent of the land, she realized something profound. She did not have to face everything alone. She did not have to be invisible to the world. And she could, perhaps, allow herself to exist beside someone who saw her not as a burden, but as a person worthy of presence and care. The night was quiet, the kind of silence that wraps around the land like a soft blanket. The native woman sat on the porch, her hands folded in her lap, staring at the distant hills that were barely visible in the dim moonlight. The wind carried the faint scent of earth and grass, and the occasional call of a nightbird echoed across the open fields. It was a peaceful night, yet inside her chest there was an unease she could not shake. She had spent so long running, hiding, and protecting herself that stillness felt unfamiliar. She had come to the ranch with the intention of staying only a night. The cowboy had insisted she remain, not as a favor, but as a recognition of her presence and value. That insistence had unsettled her at first, but over time she began to sense that maybe, just maybe, someone could care without expecting anything in return. The thought was both comforting and frightening. Earlier in the evening, she had helped prepare a simple meal. The tasks were ordinary, but the act of sharing them with someone else made her feel included in a way she had not felt in years. The cowboy had moved around the kitchen with ease, offering instructions gently when needed and letting her take the lead when she wanted. There was an unspoken rhythm in their movements, a quiet understanding that developed from shared work and mutual respect. After dinner, she had retreated to the porch, needing time to process the day. The stars above were bright and countless, and she allowed herself to imagine that each one represented a hope she had tucked away long ago. She had always carried her burdens alone, believing that asking for help was a weakness. But tonight, in the soft glow of moonlight and quiet companionship, she felt the weight of that belief begin to loosen. The cowboy joined her without a word, sitting a short distance away. His presence was calm, steady, a reminder that sometimes support could be silent and unassuming. He did not push her to speak, but he did not leave either. That balance, the ability to be near without overwhelming, was something rare, and she noticed it immediately. Hours passed, and the quiet of the night seemed to invite reflection. She began to speak, softly at first, then with growing confidence. She told him fragments of her life, not all, not the most painful, but enough to hint at the hardships she had endured. She spoke of losing family members, of traveling long distances with little to no help, of being turned away when she had hoped for kindness. Each word was careful, measured, as if she were testing whether he would accept them without judgment. The cowboy listened without interruption. He had learned that the value of listening was often greater than any advice or reassurance. Her words were heavy, but he did not recoil. He did not offer empty platitudes. Instead, he nodded gently, his eyes steady, acknowledging the truth she was sharing. "You've carried a lot on your own," he said softly. "More than anyone should have to." She looked at him, her eyes reflecting a mixture of surprise and doubt. I don't know any other way," she admitted. "It's what I've always done." "That may have been the only way you knew," he replied. "But it doesn't mean you have to keep doing it. Not now." She hesitated, unsure if she believed him. The world had taught her that trust often came with disappointment, and hope was fragile. But there was something different in his voice, a steadiness she had not encountered before. It was not pity. It was not judgment. It was recognition. And for someone who had spent so long feeling invisible, it was a revelation. Later, she attempted to carry water to the barn for the animals, but fatigue overcame her. Her legs shook slightly, and she nearly dropped the pail. The cowboy stepped forward immediately, steadying her with a firm but gentle hand. "You need to rest," he said, his voice calm but insistent. "Let me help." She tried to protest, opening her mouth to say she could manage, but the exhaustion in her body left no room for argument. She realized that accepting help did not make her weak. It simply made her human. Slowly, she allowed him to guide her to a chair on the porch, where she could sit and recover. As she rested, the cowboy spoke quietly about the importance of small victories. "It's not about never falling," he said. "It's about having someone to help you up when you do. That's how we survive." She absorbed his words, feeling a small but significant shift inside. For so long she had survived alone, and now she was learning that sharing the burden did not diminish her strength. In fact, it made her feel stronger in a way she had not expected. The night deepened, and the ranch became bathed in silver moonlight. The animals were quiet, the wind was soft, and the world felt temporarily safe. She spoke more about her travels, describing the landscapes she had crossed and the people she had met. Her stories were tinged with sadness, but also moments of quiet joy, small triumphs and fleeting connections that had kept her moving forward. The cowboy asked questions, but only gently, allowing her to control the pace and depth of the conversation. He did not rush her to reveal anything she was not ready to share. He merely offered a presence that was steady, calm, and accepting. And slowly, she began to trust that this quiet companionship could exist without threat. A sudden gust of wind rustled the trees, and she flinched slightly. He noticed immediately, moving closer to offer a comforting presence. "It's okay," he said. "You're safe here." She looked at him, her eyes wide and searching, as if trying to determine whether he was sincere. In that moment, she realized that for the first time in a long while, someone saw her not as a burden, but as a person worthy of care and attention. The realization was both liberating and frightening. She had spent years hiding, running, and surviving, and now she faced the possibility that she could exist in a space where she was acknowledged and valued. Hours passed, and fatigue finally overtook her. She leaned back in the chair, allowing herself to fully rest for the first time in a long while. The cowboy remained nearby, not demanding conversation or attention, but simply offering presence. That silent support was more powerful than any words. She felt a quiet warmth spread through her chest, a sensation she had almost forgotten, the comfort of being seen, acknowledged, and supported. As midnight approached, the wind softened, and the stars shone brighter. The native woman closed her eyes, thinking of the long roads she had traveled and the hardships she had endured. She realized that she did not have to carry everything alone anymore. She had found, even for a brief moment, a place where she could rest, a space where her presence was not a burden, but a gift. The cowboy watched her quietly, understanding the significance of this moment. He had seen many people come and go, carrying invisible weights that the world refused to acknowledge. But this time was different. She was beginning to allow herself to be seen, to let someone share the burden she had carried for so long. And that, he knew, was the first step toward healing. Finally, she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "Thank you," she said, the words carrying more weight than she could measure.
"You don't need to thank me," he replied gently. "Just stay as long as you need."
For the first time, she allowed herself to believe that staying could be safe, that her presence could be welcomed, and that rest did not mean weakness. She felt a quiet hope taking root in her chest, fragile but undeniable. And in that quiet, moonlit moment, she realized that the world did not have to be only a place of survival and solitude. There could be small moments of peace, moments where someone else could help carry the weight. She did not have all the answers, and she did not know what the future held. But she knew, for the first time in a long while, that she did not have to face it alone. The night stretched on, serene and calm. She finally allowed herself to drift into sleep, the kind of deep, undisturbed sleep that she had not known in years. The cowboy watched over her quietly, respecting her space while offering a steady, silent support. He knew that tomorrow would bring its own challenges, but tonight had changed something essential. She had begun to believe that she could rest without guilt, that her presence mattered, and that sharing her burdens did not make her weak. Morning arrived quietly over the ranch, soft golden light spilling across the fields. The native woman stirred slowly, her body lighter than it had been in years. For the first time in a long while, she had slept without fear, without the tension of carrying the world alone pressing on her chest. She opened her eyes and looked around the small room she had been allowed to call hers for a brief moment. The sight of the sun streaming through the window, the wooden floors, and the quiet familiarity of the house gave her a sense of calm she had not known in a long time. She rose carefully, moving with deliberate steps. She dressed in the same worn clothes she had traveled in, but somehow they did not feel as heavy today. The weight she had carried for so long, the fear of being a burden, the constant need to survive alone, felt slightly less pressing. It was still there, in the back of her mind, but for the first time she realized she could face it with support rather than without. Downstairs, the cowboy was already tending to the morning chores. He had noticed that she had slept well, and there was a quiet satisfaction in knowing she had finally found rest. He did not speak immediately. He understood that mornings were for quiet reflection, not hurried conversation. The land itself seemed to encourage this calm, stretching endlessly under the soft light, offering space for thoughts to wander and hearts to settle. She joined him outside, stepping carefully on the familiar wooden planks of the porch. The air was crisp, carrying the faint scent of grass, earth, and dew. She inhaled deeply, feeling a small sense of relief, almost as if the morning itself had lifted a part of her heavy spirit. She glanced at the cowboy, and he nodded, acknowledging her presence without words. She began hesitantly, her voice breaking the quiet. "I was going to leave today, like I said, but I don't think I can." He looked at her with calm eyes, waiting patiently. "You don't have to leave," he said softly. "Not if you don't want to." She considered his words carefully. Leaving had always been her instinct. It had been the way she had survived, moving from place to place, avoiding attachment, keeping herself small. But last night, for the first time, she had felt something different: safety, recognition, and a small flicker of hope. She realized that staying did not make her weak. It made her human. "I think I want to stay," she admitted finally, her voice quiet but steady. "For a while. I need time." The cowboy nodded gently, a faint smile on his face. "Then stay. You're welcome here as long as you need." For a long moment they simply stood together, letting the morning light settle over them. There was no rush, no pressure, only the quiet presence of someone who understood and accepted her. For the first time in many years, she did not feel like she had to hide or prove her worth. She was allowed to simply exist, to take up space, and to rest. Breakfast was simple, but it felt different. She ate slowly, savoring the warm bread and eggs, and the gentle conversation between them. She shared small stories, fragments of her past, and the cowboy listened quietly, offering understanding rather than judgment. Each word spoken, each glance exchanged, strengthened a bond that had begun to form over the past few days. After breakfast, she moved to help with the chores, but this time it was different. She did not move quietly to avoid being a burden. She moved confidently, aware of her own strength and capability. She carried water to the animals, swept the porch, and checked the fences, all with a sense of purpose rather than obligation. The cowboy observed quietly, offering help only when needed, allowing her the dignity of independence while providing support when required. As the day progressed, she began to notice small things she had long ignored: the beauty of the fields stretching endlessly, the gentle rhythm of the wind through the trees, the sound of the cattle moving in the corral. Each observation reminded her that life could hold moments of peace, even amid struggle. She had spent so long running from hardships that she had forgotten the quiet joys of simple existence. Now she could see them again. The cowboy suggested they walk to the far end of the ranch, where the hills rose gently and offered a view of the surrounding land. She agreed, and together they walked, their steps slow and deliberate. The wind carried the faint scent of flowers and fresh grass, and the sun warmed their backs. As they reached the top of the hill, she paused, taking in the wide, open view. The land stretched endlessly before her, and for the first time, she allowed herself to feel a sense of belonging. "You see that?" the cowboy said quietly, nodding toward the horizon. "It's all yours to share, if you want it. You don't have to face it alone." She looked at him, a small smile forming on her lips. "I think I want to learn what that feels like," she said softly. "To belong somewhere, even if it's just for a while." The cowboy nodded, understanding the weight of her words. Belonging was something she had been denied for so long, and now she was choosing it for herself. The decision was not about leaving the past behind, but about accepting the possibility of a future where she could rest, be seen, and be valued. They returned to the ranch house as the sun began to lower, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. She moved with a sense of purpose, helping to prepare dinner and tending to the animals one last time before the evening. There was a quiet confidence in her actions now, a reflection of the small but significant changes in her heart. She was learning that her presence mattered, that sharing burdens did not diminish her strength, and that trusting someone could be a source of comfort rather than danger. As night fell, she sat on the porch, wrapped in a blanket, watching the stars emerge one by one. The wind was soft, carrying the scent of earth and grass. The cowboy joined her, sitting quietly beside her. For the first time, words were not necessary. The silence itself was a gift, a shared acknowledgement that she was safe, valued, and welcome. "I don't feel like a burden anymore," she said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. "You never were," he replied. "You just needed to see it for yourself." She nodded, her eyes reflecting the faint starlight she had carried so much alone, believing that her presence was unwanted. But now she could feel the weight of that belief lifting. She had begun to understand that being seen, being valued, and being allowed to rest were not weaknesses. They were gifts. Hours passed, and the ranch became enveloped in calm. She felt a sense of peace she had not known in years, a quiet assurance that she could exist in this space without fear or hesitation. The cowboy watched her quietly, knowing that the small victories of today were significant. She had chosen to stay, to trust, and to accept the possibility of connection. That decision, he knew, was more powerful than any words could convey. Finally, she spoke again, her voice soft but steady. "I think I could stay here for a while. Maybe longer than I thought." The cowboy smiled faintly, understanding that this was not just a temporary choice. It was a commitment to herself. She had begun to embrace the possibility of rest, trust, and belonging. The past, with all its hardships, had shaped her, but it no longer defined her. She was allowed to create a new chapter, one where she could exist without carrying every burden alone. The night deepened, and the stars shone brighter. She leaned back in her chair, feeling the cool air against her face, and allowed herself to simply breathe. The weight she had carried for so long, the fear, the loneliness, the belief that she was a burden, was no longer crushing her. Instead, it was balanced by the quiet presence of someone who understood, accepted, and valued her. And in that serene, moonlit moment, she realized something profound. She did not have to face the world alone. She did not have to hide her heart or her struggles. She could belong, even if just for now. And that was enough. The cowboy remained quietly beside her, a steady presence that did not demand anything from her, but offered support in the simplest and most powerful way. She understood now that belonging was not about possession or control. It was about recognition, acceptance, and the willingness to share life with someone who cared. She finally closed her eyes, letting the cool night air soothe her, feeling the soft weight of possibility settle gently in her chest. For the first time in years, she allowed herself to imagine a future where she could stay, rest, and be seen. And in that quiet acceptance, she felt a profound sense of peace. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, its own small moments of work and quiet reflection. But tonight she had chosen to remain, to trust, and to embrace the possibility of belonging. And that choice, she realized, was the beginning of something beautiful. A chapter of life where she could exist without fear, without burden, and with the quiet assurance that she was welcome and valued.